honored to be on this panel and to talk about the church as patron and the implications, the consequence, the celebrations, and all that comes with the church as patron. So let me start with introducing Judith Mcconkey. She has her MFA in printmaking from BYU and a PhD in philosophy of art history and museum education theory from the University of Utah. She's the author of With Anxious Care, The Restoration of the Utah State Capitol, and has published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, and Sunstone. Additionally, she and her husband Jim recently published the book, Whom Say Ye That I Am? Lessons from the Jesus of Nazareth with Coford Books. Her prints and watercolors have been exhibited nationally and in the Henry Moore Gallery in London, England. And I should point out, she was my very first boss at a museum. And so I have a very fond affection for Judith, and it was a great mentor and example to me. Next is Josh Probert. He is an affiliate faculty member of the Maxwell Institute at Brigham Young University and is a historic temples design consultant to the church. He's currently finishing the late Paul L. Anderson's manuscript on early 20th century Mormon architecture to bring it to publication, and his own work, Gilded Religion in the Age of Tiffany, 1877 to 1932. Walter Rane, talented Walter Rane, received his BFA from the Art Center College of Design in Los Angeles and worked as a freelance book and magazine illustrator for 21 years. In the late 1990s, Rane was invited by the church to paint scriptural themes. This opportunity sparked an interest that he had since childhood of creating religious pictures in classical fashion. He is represented by Ray's Gallery in New York City, Cooley Gallery in Old Lyme, Connecticut, Williams Fine Art Gallery in Salt Lake City, and an Ogden Gallery in Portland, Oregon. We will start with Judith.
Let me see if I can turn this on. Thank you for coming, first of all, and I am delighted to meet Josh and Walter face to face. Their work has come through the committee that I served on up until about March of this year. I was on the stupid name, the Art Evaluation Committee for the church in terms of acceptance of fine arts and original art for temples and historic sites for the church. It was a calling that lasted 15 years. It was to be a 5-year stint, and they just kept re-upping, I think, because they were having trouble finding a female. You know, Laura, this isn't going because I don't know the password. This is the timer, and it's going to go off when it tells me I've done enough. I'm going to gallop today. This is kind of the road trip that I have 11 minutes assigned to me. And so I want to talk about patronage and some definitions of patronage that we can all accept and pretty much begin on the same plane, and then talk about it in contemporary Mormon thought. The next thing that I would like to do is to talk about the importance of an experience, and some of you may recognize John Dewey's philosophy coming in there. My dissertation was in the philosophy of art history a la John Dewey and art as experience and experience in nature, and I find that particularly applicable as we consider the visual arts and patronage in the church. So I want to talk about his concept of an experience and apply that to religious rituals then and contemporary. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is this, the mission and minefields of the church as patron. So that's where we're going. And the first thing that I want to talk about is this definition. And we can sometimes define patronage by its function, but also by context. And Samuel Johnson, the great biographer, managed to do it both, and you'll appreciate this quote very much if you're a functioning artist. A patron is one who looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water and when he has reached ground, encumbers him with help. So there's the function of a patron. He looks with unconcern at this artist struggling to make a living and to make the grade in his or her art, and then presents him with stipends, recognition, backing, etc., on conditions, with conditions. Then the other part of that is that he sees him struggling for life in the water. When he has reached ground, then he encumbers him with help. I like that definition of patronage. Robert Hughes, many of you may know, was the art critic for Time magazine for quite a long time. He was irascible. His last book was Rome, Personal History. And he was very much a provocateur. And I love this illustration because here he is, thumbs up for Picasso, but thumbs down for Damien Hirst. And he was wickedly critical of Damien Hirst. But he says in The Shock of the New, many of you have seen that video series, but also the book, artists make art today, the function of which is to hang on the wall and increase in value. That art is a commodity rather than a statement or a consideration of ideas or a language that many of us speak together. Art is therefore a commodity, and a patron is simply a buyer, a seller, an investor, a backer, and the artist and the merchandise, notice the word merchandise, or its content. Then another definition that I will offer of a patron is from F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. This is a longer quote, but notice the yellow highlights. Nick Carraway, the narrator of The Great Gatsby, says, "I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit investment and investment securities. They were put on his bookcases in the small cottage that he was in the summer that he met Gatsby, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas, J.P. Morgan, and Mycenae." Now, let me tell you who he is. 68 to 8 BCE. This is a portrait bust of him, and he was the patron of the arts during the reign of Augustus. In fact, he was a good friend of Augustus, and if you go to court in many places, particularly in Poland, as an advocate, a lawyer would be called a Mycenate. He would be an advocate, a patron of his client. But most Latin-based languages refer to patrons as Mycenates. He owned a villa that was famed on Esquiline Hill, and this is what he said. "I recognize in the genius of poets," and he was speaking primarily of the poets, but we can call them all artists, "of our time not only the truest ornament of the court, but the power of reconciling men's minds to the new order of things, and then finally of investing the actual state of affairs with an ideal glory and majesty." Now, if I wanted to rephrase that, let's do that for the purposes of discussion about temple art and temple architecture. Art and architecture are beautiful as well as decorative and ornamental, he would say. Second, so if I illustrate that, many of you recognize the Arena Chapel with Giotto's art, and it is decorative and beautiful and ornamental. But in addition to that, it is a powerful tool for teaching new ideas. And if you have been through a religious ritual, a temple experience, or other religious rituals, you understand that the visual arts and architecture, that whole encompassing environment, accustom you to new ideas and present new ideas in a language that is able to speak to you visually, which is one of the most powerful ways that we can perceive ideas. And it is a language that we can all speak without speaking Polish or Italian or English. Then if we illustrate that, some time ago, I was able to go on a vacation with a brother-in-law who speaks fluent Japanese and lived in Japan for a number of years. And he took us to Nara, to this Todaji. And it is the place that was constructed, the largest wooden structure and the most incredible Buddha. But it was constructed by the emperors and the shoguns to illustrate the power of changing men's lives through Buddhism. And then again, another illustration of that would be the great Stupa at Sanchi. And the Oshaka emperor introduced Buddhism to northern India reintroduced it, I should say, through the great stupa that contains some of the remains of the Buddha. But then we could also say that art and architecture they invest our lives with glory and majesty. If you've been to the Sistine Chapel and you walk in there and look up at the ceiling, there is power and majesty to that. Or to the small Cornero Chapel with the ecstasy of Saint Teresa. You're enveloped in this visual experience, and it invests our lives with something greater than the mundane. So we could apply that to church art and architecture. The very poor image for Minerva Teichert's World Room in the Manti Temple, the World Room in the Salt Lake Temple, then the new murals. This is James Christensen's garden in the new Nauvoo Temple. This is Idaho Falls, and you notice that it's very much site-specific art. The murals are very much site-specific. So here's Idaho Falls. And this is Montreal, I believe. And this is Mesa, Arizona, if I'm remembering that correctly. So, summary statement. And I realize that I'm galloping. I apologize for that, but 11 minutes is 11 minutes. Great art and architecture are beautiful and decorative or ornamental, as well as powerful teaching tools that invest our lives with glory and majesty. And I want to look for that last phrase, glory and majesty, and talk about John Dewey. Many of you know John, not Dewey Decimal, but John Dewey, the philosopher, probably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, American philosopher of the 20th century. And he wrote a book called Art and Experience. In fact, I brought a copy of that, and the reason that I brought the copy of that is it is the first edition, and it belonged to my father-in-law, whose music will be premiered at Carnegie Hall this evening, James McConkie. And he was here studying at Columbia when he bought that copy of Art as Experience. So this is a very sentimental journey for the family coming here today. But Dewey said this: if you wish to find out what subjective, objective, physical, mental, cosmic meaning of a thing is, go to experience and see what the thing is experienced as. Meaning that you experience this ritual of temple worship or other kind of ritual, religious ritual, and the way you define that religious idea is by the way you experience it, which puts an incredible burden on the visual experience as well as the ritual performance and the spoken word. An experience is participatory, meaning that it's minds-on as well as hands-on. And you think of ritual experiences that are minds-on as well as physical participation, and your experience there is magnified exponentially. And the art becomes that part of it. It is set apart from everyday life, that dinner, my baptism, the time we were lost, and my timer is done. Oh, heavens. All right, an experience is educatory, aesthetic, and inquiry-based. The Barnes collection is an illustration of that, and Dewey developed his ideas on art as experience through the Barnes collection and delivered a series of lectures, and I'm going to skip through that. But if we talk about that in terms of this man, in
Accordingly,
the...
I take this opportunity to announce to the entire church a program to construct some 30 smaller temples immediately. They will be in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, in Fiji, in Mexico, in Central and South America and Africa, as well as in the United States and Canada. This will make a total of 47 new temples, in addition to the 51 now in operation. I think we better add 2 more to make it an even 100.
Do you remember when he talked about that? Well, the result of that was that Gordon B. Hinckley, as patron of these 100 temples, caused the design department and the temple architecture department and building department to rethink the process of building temples. Emil Fetzer was the man who took down the murals in the Logan Temple and in the St. George Temple, and he was very much a modernist. So you see his temples, here he is. And the man who succeeded him with Gordon Hinckley's assignment was Keith Steppen. And they set up a committee that was to consider temple art and to talk about what art should be and what kinds of art should go into these new temples. And they labeled them as the years of urgency, 52 temples in 30 months. These are the standards that they set up, and you get to number 10, and look, artists sought for commissions and donations. These 2 were sought out and asked to submit to that art evaluation committee. And then from there, it would go up to the presiding bishopric and then to the first presidency. There was to be a new level of artistic quality, fewer giclée prints. Aren't you glad for that? I'm not sure that you've seen the effects of that. The budgets were increased for original art. And finally, and this will be very quick, but this is what I'd like to address specifically. The benefits of that is budget increase, high quality giclée prints, and I emphasize high quality, but that's not always the case. But the challenge of that is that the number of murals and framed works depended on temple sizes, and there was this urgency to construct new. Then if budgets, there was the danger of overexposure of those giclée prints. If you've seen them at the bottom of the elevator, you see them at the top of the elevator, yes? All right. The committee approval process eliminated end runs that people would go from their own particular place and time up to a general authority and say, you need to put this in, I had a revelation. And it eliminated that end run. But the church owns the reproduction and copyrights of the art, and I think that's a real challenge, because then it doesn't take into consideration the contracts and honoraria that are due these professional artists who, like Johnson said, are struggling to get to shore, and then when they get to shore and become professionals and well accomplished and known, then we deign to say, we recognize you and we put the limits on you. So the last thing that I want to say is that we need more site-specific, and one of the challenges is that taste and leadership changes. But the big idea remains this. It is patrons recognize that the visual arts and architecture they sponsor or facilitate can be powerful ornamental and decorative tools that help our minds integrate and assimilate new concepts of eternal importance, as well as invest and experience in temple worship with ideal glory and majesty. So, Gallup ended. So, Walter, you need me to change? Are you ready to change?
Mormon temples embody the conflicted, often paradoxical relationship that Latter-day Saints have had with aesthetic experience over the duration of the church's history. When Joseph Smith revived the ancient concept of temple from the pre-modern, pre-Protestant past, he argued that aesthetic experience was not a distraction from salvation, but that it was an integral component of it. Mormon temples are also an expression of the 19th century tensions between modernism and anti-modernism writ large, meaning modernity and the effects of modernity. They aim, these temples, to revive ancient concepts of the divine, but using the material discourses of the present. When Smith first administered the endowment in the second story of his red brick store in Nauvoo, this was in 1842, he organized a series of compartments that would act as metaphorical backgrounds of Adam and Eve's journey from the preexistence through the creation, the fall, and mortality, and the afterlife. In this temporary temple, and in future temples to come, the built environment of the endowment overlaid the widely held belief in the progress of Western civilization over the journey of Adam and Eve. Like the non-Western, quote, savages that Western powers were busy colonizing, Smith's Adam and Eve progressed from a state of nakedness in a wilderness to a grand parlor of refined living similar to those found in contemporary hotels, grand houses, and men's clubs. In the Nauvoo Temple, at the attic, Brigham Young similarly hung portraits, maps, and mirrors in his makeshift celestial room. In a visual statement of Young's authority at the time that James J. Strang was most stridently contesting it, Brigham Young hung a 7-foot portrait of himself by Salah Van Sickle in the center of the celestial room when you came through the veil, with over 20 smaller portraits of people who had followed Young in the succession controversy. So Smith and Young and later LDS leaders, through this metaphor of the celestial room, they equated godhood with Western gentility, an ideology drenched in class strife and class status and their totems. They also employed discourses of artistic tastes that elites had adopted to reinforce class boundaries in the wake of the fall of European monarchies. Arriving in heaven was like entering, one of these grand parlors. And today, these grand rooms are sites of hushed repose in which Latter-day Saints meditate, pray, and in Protestant self-analysis take stock of their discipleship as they are a metaphorical Adam and Eve. And so this Victorian heaven is an interpretation that stands in stark contrast to Mormon teachings of heaven, which is a place of endless striving, of work, of struggle, and where, if God himself can weep, then pain and sorrow actually continue in heaven, just on a cosmic scale. Enlisting the material discourses of gentility resonated, though, with these 19th century concepts of heaven as a domestic realm. At the same time, though, other discourses viewed Western progress as antithetical to the heavenly parlor. For these people, untouched nature was where paradise was and where Eden was. Romantic painters such as those not far from here on the Hudson River School, they would have ended the endowment back where it began, in the garden room. The celestial rooms of the Utah temples followed Nauvoo precedents of portraiture and mirrors, but they dropped the maps that had hung previously. In the Salt Lake Temple, for example, church leaders placed sculpture busts of priesthood leaders in the niches of doorways over the pediments, and a study of a sculpture group for a large outdoor monument of Joseph Hiram Smith. They also had portraits of Brigham Young, Wilford Woodruff, etc. And leading into the celestial room, portraits of the priestesses of Zion, Eliza Snow, Elizabeth Ann Whitney, Zina Huntington Young, etc. Now, at the same time, sculptures were supposed to go in the exterior of the building. There were aedicules that are still there, where a statue of Joseph and Hiram Smith would stand. And the Truman Angel's plans for the temple show that in the capitals at the top of the interior pilasters, There would be sculptures of members of the Smith family and church leaders, similarly to what Leopold Eidlitz realized in the construction of the New York State Capitol with great Union generals. Now, in the same time, the idea of these sculptures resonated with domestic parlor culture, that these were characteristic of upper class houses. But 20th century aesthetic preferences and anti-Catholic sentiment made some Latter-day Saints uncomfortable with sculpture in their sacred spaces, and they were soon removed and are currently prohibited from any temple. Now, in Pioneer, Utah, the designers of the Endowment House and the later temples introduced murals to metaphorically create a unique sense of space within these rooms that led to the celestial parlor. Murals like these were a borrowing from the 19th century convention of panoramas. And while the painters who studied at the Académie Julian in Paris are the most famous of Mormon muralists, they were not the first. They were just politically savvy enough to convince George Buchanan, to convince the First Presidency to pay for them to go to Paris to study. The Endowment House and temples in St. George, Logan, and Manti also had murals. The only one of these murals that exists from the Pioneer era is in the Creation Room, and it is by C.C.A. Christensen of 1888. The temples in Hawaii, Cardston, and Mesa, they demonstrated a unity of design in which architects oversaw the design of the building, the interior architecture. They designed the furniture, and the design and placement of each individual painting and mural. Under the influence of the Chicago School, these buildings evidence the more long shadow of South Kensington design reform of the 1850s under the aegis of Prince Albert, Thomas Cole, Owen Jones, etc. And during this time, church leaders ranging from state presidents to general authorities, if you read these dedicatory services and the newspaper reports, they're all quoting John Ruskin, the wellspring of anti-modernist yearnings. Ruskin had decried the invention of art in the 18th century, most notably the 1750s, and the shifting categories and invention of fine and decorative arts and applied arts, so-called, and these moves that were made in order to establish the taste and the hegemony of academies, of salons, and to keep women out of these groups. Women's work could not be art, right? Because of the invention of the romantic artist, the genius, the individual genius, all this stuff. Well, women couldn't be geniuses. They couldn't be imaginative. Therefore, even Mary Wollstonecraft says women artists are really men inhabiting female bodies. And so Ruskin and acolytes such as William Morris, Louis Comfort Tiffany, and John Lafarge, whose windows are through that scaffolding, and Frank Lloyd Wright would have applauded these temples' bas-relief sculptures, highly articulated walls, integrated paintings, surface treatments, coordinating furniture, and custom-designed hardware and light fixtures. During the mid-20th century, church leaders exchanged this immersive, participatory aesthetic experience for a passive utilitarian one. The functionalist aesthetic of unadorned European modernism that characterized these buildings had no tolerance for symbols, ornament, and sumptuous materials. Beginning with the temple in Switzerland, architects designed boxy, unornamented with buildings with very plain interiors that lacked murals, that lacked progressive endowment rooms. And these changes accompanied the shortening and the condensing of the temple rituals themselves. The temples of the second half of the 20th century were sort of a material manifestation of one scholar's statement that utility was the great idol of the 20th century. Decades earlier, Max Weber, the German sociologist, had said that Mormonism is to be located somewhere between a monastery and a factory. And in doing that, he was saying something prescient about salvation theology and dovetailing with Protestant work ethic. But temples in the 20th century make this observation all the more convincing and compelling. The Provo, Utah temple was the apogee of Taylorist utilitarianism. Any imagery was limited to a few landscape painting and multiple framed prints of Bible illustrations. No murals, no progressive endowment rooms, and very plain middle-class furniture. Automated technology turned lights on and off, raised and lowered draperies, turned it on and off video projector, leaving officiators largely as mute sentinels. At the same time, modernist architect Emil Fetzer, whom Sister McConkie mentioned, convinced the First Presidency to gut the Logan Temple that had been built in 1884. And he later, in an oral history in the church history department, said that his only regret was that he wasn't able to knock down the entire building and build a modern proper one, like Provo and Ogden. So because these interiors and many of the interiors today have very plain walls, no coffering or otherwise articulation, this has led to a profusion of framed prints to cover the plain surfaces. There's this lack. What do we do with them? If you go down the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, there are no framed paintings, right? Because the architecture is interesting enough that you don't need it. So in terms of imagery, portraiture of priesthood authority was discontinued in the early 20th century. And at the same time, temple designers and leaders began replacing the iconography of Mormon peculiarity with an iconography of Protestant inclusion. Landscapes of Adam-on-Dayaman and the Hill Cumorah have been exchanged for generic local landscapes. Paintings by the Seventh-day artist painter Harry Anderson hang on the walls of the council room of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. And Anderson's Second Coming hangs in the terrestrial room of the Salt Lake Temple. These paintings and the hundreds of reproductions of them in Mormon temples throughout the world demonstrate a consensus fiction about what Jesus looks like. And exported throughout the world, they act as agents of visual colonization. Now, during the late 20th century, church leaders, most stridently Bishop H. Burke Peterson, grew uneasy with the austere aesthetics of temples and all alterations made to historic ones, and sought to reintroduce some of the aesthetic elements that previous generations had abandoned. Most of the temples constructed during the early 21st century took this reorientation even further. Now, although there are some modernist utilitarians that still wield considerable influence, a cadre of architects and designers, combined with important, powerful leaders like Elder Packer and President Hinckley, they prioritize tradition over innovation and beauty over utility. And they have exerted a large influence in recent temple aesthetics. This has opened a window for LDS painters and glassmakers to create original artworks for temples, whose interior architecture is also now more ornate than those of the 1960s through the 1990s. At the same time, the church has enlisted Mormon painters and art glassmakers, to do all this. There has been now the reintroduction of uniquely Mormon imagery, Book of Mormon images from church history, etc. At present, though, a tension exists between institutional preferences and Mormon artists that goes beyond content. Graduates of architecture, design, studio art programs are taught to value individualism, self-expression, and perpetual novelty. And while Mormonism may accommodate these characteristics, a religion requires communalism, shared tradition, repetition, and tradition. At the same time, church leaders and architects have agreed, though, that part of the problem is that both sides have agreed to the discourse that modernity has dealt them without examination or critique. These are discourses that, in the language of the Book of Mormon, divides all types into warring camps of ites. Artists versus craftsmen, painters versus illustrators, and other facile distinctions. Both ideas have adopted the relatively new proposition that there is such a thing as art. Both have abandoned ancient, classical, medieval, and Renaissance ways of viewing all forms of craft, or techne in Greek, ars in Latin, as meritorious contributions to the creation of sacred space. Acceding to the terms of modernity's rupture and its divisions creates a discursive obstacle to the Mormon project of fully resurrecting the ancient notion of temple.
I'll begin by saying that myself, not being a scholar of anything, I will speak purely of my own experience. When I finished art school, this was 1973, I was trained to be a book and magazine illustrator, and I drove from Los Angeles to the East Coast to begin my career. Along the way, I decided to stop in Salt Lake City and naively show my work, my portfolio, to, quote, the church. I had an introduction to somebody who worked for the Children's Friend, so that got me in the door, but it didn't really lead anywhere. I know that, well, I think that even in retrospect, there really wasn't any structure in the church to evaluate artists and art, at least that I could find. It wasn't until the church, I was well into my career in the mid to late 80s when the church established the Museum of Church History and Art, which it was known by at the time. And they started the international art competitions. And that was my doorway into presenting myself, my work, to the church. I entered those international competitions, and after having entered several, sometime in the late 90s, I was contacted by curators of the church museum, presenting to me the opportunity. They just said, it's an open invitation. If you ever do any work that you think we would be interested in, show it to us, and we'll decide. To me, this was a thrilling opportunity, thrilling prospect, as vague as it was. The opportunity to express my personal beliefs, bear my testimony, if you will, through my work, and present it to the church and see if they had need for it. As an illustrator, my work was clearly an arrangement between a client who had an idea or a need and me, who could hopefully visualize that idea and need and paint or draw something that would that would serve everyone. When it came to working for the church, I found that, well, to this day, I know we're talking about church as a patron, but to this day I have done very few paintings that would be called commissions, where the church had a need, an idea, and they would ask me to fill that need. That's happened a handful of times, but generally speaking, it's been that open invitation. I did what I wanted, what I felt was, reading the scriptures, I expressed my vision of those scriptures and those gospel principles and present it to, at that time, it was the curators of the museum that I would present it to. I knew very little of the series of committees and approval process after that. I just kind of dealt with those people, and they would either send it back or send it through. So one of the very first things I did when this invitation was presented to me was this painting of Christ and Satan. When I took it to the church museum and unwrapped it to show, at that time it would have been either Robert Davis or Richard Oman, who were the curators of the museum. Another individual came by, and I was introduced. He said, this is so-and-so, a member of the church temple art evaluation committee. So I thought immediately, this is fantastic. I said, this painting is perfect for the temple. This person kind of looked at me sideways and said, you think that's going in a temple? And said, that's interesting. And of course it didn't. It didn't make it through any committees. It was never taken into the collection of the church. But that was my experience. That's how I dealt with it. I expressed myself and let them say yes or no. This was another one I did shortly thereafter. The Good Samaritan is a parable that I go back to often because I find it to be really the encapsulation of the gospel, the atonement and the pure gospel of Jesus Christ is in that story, in that parable of the Good Samaritan. Again, I presented it to the church, and I received a phone call this time from somebody in the publications and curriculum department saying, I want to express to you that I really love that painting. I think it's beautiful. But I want to express my regrets also because I don't think it's appropriate for use in the church. And I'm sorry we won't be able to use it. To my surprise, it has been used. It was acquired. It did go to some committees, and it pops up here and there unexpectedly. And so, again, I don't know what's going to happen. I just do what I want and see what comes of it. This is a painting that would have turned out very differently if it had been a commission. It started out much larger, much more complicated, more figures, more environment. But since it was turning into something that I didn't really like, it was just more of a visualization of a particular scene. And I was after something different. I was after an expression of the power of Christ to heal. So I gradually pared it down, obscured the face of Christ, kind of abstracted some of the environment, and tried to focus on the action. When I finished it and was finally satisfied with it, I determined personally that stylistically it probably wasn't something that the church would be interested in. So I put it up in my studio. And it wasn't until later when Robert Davis, one of those curators, was visiting my studio in Oregon and saw it and expressed interest in it and said, I'd like to present this. And fortunately, he did, and it became part of the church collection. This one was done for specifically for one of those competitions that we were talking about. They happen every 3 years. There's one being juried right now. And it was, the theme that year obviously was the Book of Mormon. And when I submitted the painting, again, I received a call, but this time from one of the jurors saying, we really like the painting. We're going to include it in the show, but we'll be returning it to you after the show because there's a doctrinal problem with this. He said, we've been informed that angels don't act like that, and we can't have it in the church collection. So during the show, I decided to plead my case and explain that, to me, even though I'm very much in the realist, my work is not inaccessible, it's pretty easy to read. I don't consider my paintings to be snapshots of events or scenes as if I had been there at this event. To me, the angel, it was very important that the angel his pose be designed to show that he was actively involved in the lives of Alma the Younger and the sons of Mosiah, and therefore in our lives, that angels are part of our existence and our life's journey. When the show was concluding, I did receive a call saying that they had reconsidered and would like to acquire the painting for the church collection. This one is an exception in several ways. It was a commission, specifically a commission for a specific temple to be put in a specific place that the designer had designed for a painting, and it was prescribed what the subject would be. It went through the process. of submitting drawings, having the drawings corrected, eventually approved, having the painting go through all the committees, including the First Presidency, and hung in the temple. Before the temple was open, though, it was taken down because the temple president didn't like it. He felt that it looked like Jesus was dancing. And I said, "What's wrong with that?" I don't know. But anyway, so I mean, we think of the church as being obviously very hierarchical, if that's the right word. Of, you know, if you reach the top, you're okay. But sometimes, you know, it's a little more messy process than that. This painting was part of a series of 16 paintings that I did that were commissions, but not by the church. They were commissioned by a private party who felt that there needed to be more Book of Mormon images available, and asked me to do them. It was a very comfortable commission, though. The party allowed me to choose the subjects. There was some discussion, but I had a great deal of freedom as to what scenes in the Book of Mormon to paint. And so it was a commission, but it didn't feel like one. This is one of those paintings that the series, most of the series, is on display at the Lincoln Square building. I don't know how common that process is of having a third party involved in commissioning work and then having that third party submit it to the church. This is the only time in my experience that it happened, but it worked out very well for me. I have continued to submit artwork to the church. It's been a little over 20 years, about probably 21 or 22 years. And I can't say that even today I have any better feeling for what's going to be accepted and what's not. And I've become comfortable with that. Although, well, it's frustrating, but I think that arrangement has led to better work on my part, at least, because I didn't really feel like somebody was standing over my shoulder correcting my brushstrokes, that I could do what I wanted and then do what I thought was best. And the results were generally better than when I did feel like somebody was standing over my shoulder correcting my every move. This was a painting that, to me personally, I regretted that the church did not want to take it into the collection because it's personally one of my favorites. So it ended up in a private collection. So that was one that I would have predicted would have been accepted, but was not. This was an actual commission, one of the few that started out as a commission and worked out to my satisfaction as well as to the church's satisfaction. This was, I just included this because it's a personal favorite of mine, and it was accepted into the church collection. This is fairly recent submission that was not accepted, and ended up in somebody's home. It's pretty large. Seems like kind of a dramatic thing to put over your sofa, but some people like that. I've been fortunate that to work under these conditions. Like I said, it can be frustrating, but it has worked. And I selected images to show a variety of kind of the reactions and the process. But over these years, I've had 71 pieces accepted by the church. So it's worked for me. 15 of those were for the temple, although that's kind of a guess, because early on, the temple was not so exclusive. I would submit something that would be accepted by the church, and later on it would appear in a temple. It wasn't like now where it was either the temple or not, and if it gets in the temple, it doesn't go anywhere else. That didn't always exist, but that's the way it is now. I simply consider it a great privilege to do work that serves this worthy purpose and contributes in some way to the work of the Lord. And of course, it also allows me to express things that are very precious to me. So, thank you.
Walter, I just want to say bless you for still trying and for working. You faced a lot of very frustrating experiences, and there's quite a few artists, and rightly so, that decide to take their paintbrushes and go home and say, I'm not playing with you anymore. So bless you for trying still. One of the things I wanted to talk about really quickly, because I know we're short on time, is your Book of Mormon series. It was commissioned by a church member who I should shout out, who is Brad Palo, who is also one of the patrons of this festival. And similarly, Arnold Freeberg's Book of Mormon series was personally funded and commissioned by a church member. In that case, it was Adele Cannon Howells. Also, Tykert's Book of Mormon series was personally funded. It was a project she funded by herself. It was a personal project that she did on her own. She self-financed. It's a very clear trend with all of these three major bodies of work that are ubiquitous to Mormon art today. That the church wasn't the patron. That the church either wasn't able or just didn't act as patron. Why do you think that was the case? What is the lesson to artists and members here? And what do these projects as a model suggest for future projects? And that's a question for all three of you.
Before I answer that, I wanted to quickly make a couple of comments very quickly about Walter's experience being on the other end of it. And he noted that there are some paintings that were accepted into the church's collection, meaning the Church Museum of History and Art. And that is a different entity and a different committee, or I know nothing of the workings of that. But the workings of the Temple Arts Committee, I risk, obviously the deliberations are confidential, but in no case was Walter's work declined by our committee. It's when it goes up the hierarchy, and as I said in my presentation, tastes differ depending on who's in charge. And there are several artists that we fought long and hard to have approval for, who were considered too modern, too abstract, too this, too that. One painting that went up to the first presidency, someone made the comment that Jesus didn't really look like that. And so what do? They can no pun intended, everyone. But I think that this personal funding and private patronage has become the rule because the church's committee approvals are so high. And seemingly because they're private arbitrary. So that's the best that I can do in terms of that.
Well, I would guess that from the artist's point of view, at least from my point of view, that sounds fantastic. They come to me, I get to do work, and then from there on, it's out of my hands. So I think that the question there is, where do the patrons come from? I don't know. I was fortunate that That fellow sought me out, because I didn't seek him.
I think we are out of time. I have a list of 20 other questions, but we'll have to go to lunch or something. Thank you, everyone.